Sup everyone, it's episode 2 of this, second verse, same as the first. I was happy to get some positive feedback on the last video, and it turns out that a lot more people are into reading books and video games than I would have thought, which is awesome, because even though that's not my thing, even though I prefer to stare at paper when I read because it's easier on my eyes and I'm a little bit of a Luddite, I endorse any situation where people are recreationally reading, so that's cool. Also, I've decided that from now on, I'm going to try to come up with a singular question to pose to the audience whenever I can think of one that doesn't suck. Because I like the idea of these videos being a little more interactive than me just bludgeoning you with my thoughts. And also because I genuinely believe that YouTube comment sections don't need to be as horrible as they so often are. To me, comment sections are like plants. Sometimes you have to give them attention and feed them a little if you want them to be healthy. And if you're neglecting it, then they can rot and turn on you. And there'll always be trolls. There'll always be that guy who we all kind of live in fear of. You know, that one guy who takes things way too serious, who's just there to hijack the first thread he sees and turn it into a battlefield. And unless you submit to every line in their diatribe, they will never stop arguing with you because they're never offline. They're always there. They never go away. You get notifications that they're still yelling at you like weeks later, and you're like, Jesus, you win. I don't even care anymore. Just leave me alone. Please, get a life. There's only so much that can be done about those people, but it's important to remember that even on a site like this, that's notorious for having a harassment issue, those dudes are in the vast minority, even if it's a loud one occasionally. Most commenters, most users, from my experience, are chill and easygoing and are able to respect other people's opinions, even if they completely disagree with them. And those are the people I'm making these videos for, besides myself. So, yeah, keep doing what you're doing, folks, and I'll do my best to feed you. Unless what you're doing is bad, in which case, please stop. I will say, though, I'm only going to ask questions if I legitimately think it'd be interesting to hear answers to them, because if I just force myself to come up with a question every time, I'll wind up phoning it in. I'll wind up asking dumb things, like, look, the sky is blue in this game. Do you like the color blue? There's a cheese wheel in this game, too. Do you like cheese? What's your favorite kind of cheese? Subscribe and tell me what kind of cheese you eat. By the way, the best cheese? Smoked Gouda with bacon. Oh, so good. But alas, I don't have time to talk about cheese, because I gotta get to the main topic of today's video, Star Wars Episode VIII, The Last Jedi, a film I saw in theaters a few weeks ago that I had been eagerly anticipating, since I liked Episode VII, The Force Awakens, and I enjoyed Rogue One as well. And I prepared for The Last Jedi the same way I prepare for any movie that I plan to see in theaters these days. I avoided watching a single full trailer or ad for it. Every time a commercial for it would pop up, every time I would start to see an article that was clearly about the movie, I would avert my eyes, which was not easy to pull off because they were everywhere over the last month, but I had to do it this way because I don't know how to forget things that I see in trailers and commercials. I will imprint things that I see in those ads to memory. So if I see in a trailer that there's a scene where one character is talking to another character and it's snowing in the background, I will watch the film waiting for that thing I saw in the trailer to happen. And as I'm watching it, I'll be doing the play-by-play in my head. I'll be thinking, okay, so I know that at some point in this film, these two characters are going to be in the same space together, so even though they're on opposite ends of the world right now, something is going to happen that's going to bring them together, and it's going to be snowing. It sucks watching a movie like that, and I know it's tough to avoid all teasers, especially when the film is a pop culture behemoth like Star Wars, but going into a film fresh without any clue as to how it's going to unfold is the best way to watch something, especially because there are some trailers nowadays where they give the whole damn movie away, which is why trailers are to be avoided in general, in my opinion. The other way I prepared for this movie was by initiating a self-imposed social media blackout in the week leading up to its release. And I had to learn to do this the hard way because 2 years ago, I was on Twitter a day or two before The Force Awakens was released everywhere, and I was looking at a conversation thread that had nothing to do with Star Wars. It was probably about Donald Trump. And some jackass, some scourge of humanity, posted a GIF apropos of nothing of the scene in the film where Han Solo drops to his death. The footage was a shaky cam bootleg recording, but it was clearly visible what was happening in it. And so, because of this bastard who probably thought they were being super cool posting a gif of something that no one had seen before, I went into The Force Awakens not only knowing that Han Solo was going to be killed, but that it would involve him falling off a high platform. I was not thrilled about that. So this time around, I took every possible precaution to avoid spoilers and go into the theater with a clean slate and no preconceived notions as to how it would unfold. With one exception. I watched this film fully expecting Luke Skywalker to die in it, since the film is called The Last Jedi, and there's no way they were going to kill Rey, and I felt that it would be false advertising if The Last Jedi was just a nickname and there were 2 Jedis at the end of the film. So it made sense that this was going to be the end of Luke, that this would be the send-off of his character with Mark Hamill, and that there'd be a passing of the torch, with Rey becoming the new savior of the universe. And I was right. Otherwise, I didn't know what to expect. I should also say I had steered clear of any reviews for it too. And I was watching it in the theater with my delegation, so to speak, and with about 40 minutes to go in the movie, the thought actually came to me as though it was an epiphany. I love this movie. And when it was over, I turned to the people I saw it with, and I said, that is the best Star Wars film I have ever seen in my life. And I stand by that. They'll never stop making Star Wars movies. There will be a million more by the time I die. But as of right now, that is the best Star Wars experience I've ever had in a theater, and I have seen every Star Wars film that I've been alive for on the big screen. The Last Jedi was written and directed by Rian Johnson, who had previously directed a few films such as Brick, The Brothers Bloom, and Looper, all of which were good by the way. But he also directed 3 episodes of Breaking Bad, and in fact, his final credit on IMDb prior to The Last Jedi was the Ozymandias episode from the final season of Breaking Bad, which he directed, and is one of the greatest hours of television I've ever seen. And if there's one constant between those Breaking Bad episodes and his earlier movies, it's that Rian Johnson is very comfortable directing material that revolves around the relationships and interactions between people when they're put in gritty and rather outlandish situations. He has a knack for personalizing stories and making them character-driven even when the setting around them is pretty crazy. And he took that sensibility and transferred it onto Star Wars and created a film that isn't so much about the fight between the Resistance and the First Order, as much as it's about Rey and Finn and Poe and Kylo Ren and Luke and how they're coming to terms with the actions they've taken that have led them to be a part of this epic. The film is not centered on the broader conflict of this universe. It's centered on the characters and the doubts and mistakes they make along the way, and whether or not they have conviction that they're really doing the right thing by being on their side of the fight. It's a character drama that's wrapped inside an action film. And while that's not entirely new ground for this series, there's never been a Star Wars film that was this devoted to exploring everyone's motivations. There's never been a Star Wars film where these magic-wielding spacemen felt this much like real people, who are where they are, not because they're destined to have been drawn to the dark side or the light side, but because their lives have been dictated by complications and screw-ups and human errors, just like ours have been. This film gave me everything I could have wanted out of a Star Wars movie. It has all the markings of Star Wars. It has a lively John Williams score and a giant returning cast of characters we're all familiar with by now. But it brings something new to the series, and wasn't afraid to take huge risks with its storytelling, which I give Rian Johnson a lot of credit for. It takes some bravery to write a Star Wars movie that turns Luke Skywalker into an exile, and puts Leia in a coma, and kills off Snoke midway through the film. But to me, those are the sort of things that had to happen in this movie if the franchise was going to continue to stay fresh. To me, if you're going to make an episode 7, 8, and 9, and if you're going to bring back Han Solo and Luke and Leia and Chewie, this is the way it had to be done. You have to be willing to further develop those people by making them vulnerable and putting them through conflict again. Because otherwise, we'd just be staring at a bunch of 60-year-old sacred cows who wouldn't have anything unique to offer beyond nostalgia. The number one priority needed to be making a compelling story first, even if it came at the expense of beloved characters that viewers wouldn't mind seeing more of. And that's exactly what happened. I thought this was an outstanding movie, and when I allowed myself to look at the internet again, I was not surprised that most critics, including the ones I respect the most, loved this film. What was initially surprising to me, what caught me off guard at first, was finding out that an enormous amount of diehard Star Wars fans hated The Last Jedi. On Rotten Tomatoes, as of this recording, the film has a 90% approval rating among professional reviewers, which means it's critically acclaimed and certified fresh. But only 50% of audience goers claim they like the film, which is an almost unheard of discrepancy. The site has been besieged by angry fanboys who have given the film the lowest audience score of any Star Wars movie in history, outside of that CG Clone Wars movie that no one remembers, which is insane. The fact that the same people who defended the prequels find this movie to be an unacceptable entry into the Star Wars canon, that is incredible. The backlash is so strong that there is a Change.org petition right now that currently has 83,000 signatures that demands that Disney erase this movie and reshoot another Episode 8 in its place. Allow me to read the bulk of this petition verbatim. Episode 8 was a travesty. It completely destroyed the legacy of Luke Skywalker and the Jedi. It destroyed the very reasons most of us, as fans, liked Star Wars. This can be fixed. Just as you wiped out 30 years of stories, we ask you to wipe out one more. The Last Jedi. Remove it from canon, push back Episode 9, and remake Episode 8 properly to redeem Luke Skywalker's legacy, integrity, and character. We stuck by you when you did things that hurt us before, so we ask you now, please don't let this film stand. Don't do this to us! Don't take something so many of us loved so much and destroy it like this. Let us keep our heroes. And then there's IMDb, where the film has a much more respectable rating from users, likely since there isn't quite as much of an organized effort to bring down its score like there is on Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. But the top featured user reviews that accompany its IMDb page are uniformly negative. In fact, here is the first user review that popped up for me when I went to its page. It's very short, so I can read it in its entirety. Tons of plot holes, Luke Skywalker's character ruined, J.J. Abrams' work and characters dumped, and yes, it is spelled Abrahams here, no character development, rushed romance, in quotes, bad main plot, bad side plots, totally lacking any lore. As of this recording, 669 out of 937 users on IMDb found that review helpful. The person who gave that review gave The Last Jedi a 1 out of 10. They gave The Force Awakens a 10 out of 10. Here's the thing. Fan is short for fanatic. To be a diehard fan of something is to be almost irrationally attached to it, to the extent that you feel the need to protect it, to safeguard it. To be a hardcore fan of something is to view that thing that you love almost like it's a friend, like it's a person, which I know sounds weird, but sometimes entertainment can mean a lot to people. It can inspire and motivate and get people through hard times. And if they develop a lifelong connection with something, people will stop treating it as merely a piece of entertainment, because to them, it's more than that. It's a part of their lives. And Star Wars was and still is a part of many people's lives. And this reaction that so many fans have, that this movie wasn't only not to their liking, but deserves to be eradicated, is not particularly rational, but it's understandable. It's understandable because for 40 years, from the very first Star Wars movie, which came out in 1977, Luke Skywalker has existed only as a good-willed, pleasant, affable hero. And in this movie, which takes place about 30 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, we see a very different Luke Skywalker. We find out that he's a hermit and curmudgeonly and caustic, and that he's made misjudgments so grave that he inadvertently wound up pushing Kylo Ren to the dark side. And to hardcore fans who have only known Luke as more or less the opposite of all that, as maybe the greatest hero in the history of cinema, it's a shock to the system. It feels like a betrayal. To them, Rian Johnson did something blasphemous. First by putting a Luke Skywalker on screen who was different from the one they had known for 4 decades, and then by killing him off and having him disappear from the saga entirely. And I know why they feel this way, seriously, because I know what it's like to view a piece of entertainment as something more precious than it really is. And I'll give you an example. I've never really touched on this, but I am a gigantic fan of Dragon Ball Z. It is a part of my childhood and was an entryway into friendship for me. Literally half the people I met in elementary school, I met because I was able to talk about DBZ with them back when it was first airing in America and was insanely popular. I have an enormous affinity for Dragon Ball Z. I'll defend it to the death. And a few years ago, there was a sequel series to it called Dragon Ball Super that began airing. And I started watching it, and there are moments in the show where they tweak the continuity a little, where they redefine certain elements of the canon. And every time that happens, I get irrationally nervous. I'll think to myself, don't do it. Don't retcon my childhood. Do not make me have to reassess the way I looked at this show that I watched in 2002. Don't do it. But it's always a fleeting thought, and never goes further than that. Because at some point, you gotta learn to let go. You, and by you I mean all of us, have to accept that you're not in control of the show or movie that you like. You don't own it. You're not in charge of it. You're essentially just renting it. It's great if you like something that someone else made, but the people who made that thing are not obligated to make it for your approval in perpetuity. It doesn't belong to you. And let's say hypothetically, I watch an episode of Dragon Ball Super that I find underwhelming and disappointing and below the standards that I'd like it to reach. At the end of the day, it's okay, because that original series will still be there. Just because it's part of something more expansive than it was when I was a kid, just because people look at it a little differently now, that doesn't mean it's gone. It's still there. It can still be enjoyed. And the same thing is true of Star Wars. Even if you hate The Last Jedi, even if you think it's awful, the original trilogy is still there for you. And that's why I can discount almost all of the complaints that fanboys seem to have with The Last Jedi, because they're mostly mad at it from a macro level, how they think it should have gone compared to other films. I sincerely believe that as time goes on, as newer generations watch this film without any expectations as to how an older Luke Skywalker is supposed to behave, none of this will matter to them, because they'll just accept that that's what it is and judge the film on its own merits. And as a singular, standalone film, isolated from fandom, it is a very well-made action movie. Plus, if I'm being honest, some of the complaints that I've read come off more as broad venting than legitimate criticism. For instance, the knock that this film is weak in the lore department, that is not untrue, per se, but it's also one of the best parts about The Last Jedi. I mean, I love Star Wars. I love the aesthetic of it, and the creativity and imagination that goes into it, and all the aliens and planets and technology. That part is awesome. The mythology aspect of Star Wars, about who the Sith are, and who the Jedi are, and how they came to be, and who created lightsabers, that has never interested me. It always came off to me as something that was best left to the imagination. And sure enough, in the prequels, when they go back to show the origin of Emperor Palpatine and how Yoda wound up in a swamp and who built C-3PO and how Darth Vader became evil, it was terrible. It was crap. This film series is at its best when it spends more time focusing on the relationships between the characters and less time reverse engineering a history for them. A great example of this is that in the prequels, they established Darth Vader as something close to a satanic figure. He's the product of a virgin birth where he was conceived by the Force itself, like an evil version of Jesus. He's the child of prophecy. He slaughters a room full of children at one point. They make him an utterly unapproachable, unsympathetic, unrelatable monster who's just a one-dimensional, whiny, violent idiot. Compared to that, I like that Kylo Ren's origin is more grounded and complex. I like that he is where he is because he had bad parenting and bad training and his anger issues. And that he isn't really evil. He is where he is because of circumstances, which is true to life. Similarly, I like that Rey is a random commoner, and that her parents weren't anything special, which we find out in this movie. I will concede that it is a little bit of a red herring that these films built up the mystery of who her parents were, only for it to turn out that they're nobodies and that it doesn't matter. It wouldn't surprise me if one day we learned that there were creative changes that took place between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, and that at one point, the identity of her parents really did have significance. But I actually prefer it this way. They could have made her origin mythology heavy. They easily could have had a scene where Luke kneels down in front of her and goes, "Rey, the reason you have such a strong connection to the Force is that you are the reincarnation of Qui-Gon Jinn. His life force flows through you, and you need merely to learn how to unlock his power to fulfill your destiny as the greatest Jedi in all the galaxy." They could have done something like that, but I like it better this way. I think it's cool that you don't have to be a child of prophecy or come from a special bloodline to be the hero of the story. It can be anybody, because the Force flows through everybody. I find that much more inspirational than if it turned out her strength was only hereditary. Speaking of strong female characters, another thing that was interesting about this movie is that Princess Leia plays a very prominent role in it, and Carrie Fisher, who portrays her, died almost exactly 1 year earlier, and needless to say, they won't be able to use her in Episode 9. And there are a couple moments in Episode 8 where they could have killed off her character fairly organically if they wanted to. At one point, she enters a coma, and they could have set it up so that she just never gets out of it, and that could have served as the explanation as to why she's not in the next movie. But they didn't go that route, and I love that. I love that Rian Johnson decided, you know what, so what if it makes the timeline a little messy? So what if her sudden disappearance will have to be accounted for in the next movie? So what? Let's just make the best movie we can right now with the footage we have and the people who are in it. And it turned out for the best. He could have pulled a George Lucas and cut half her scenes and edited a third of the movie in some misguided effort to smooth out the continuity, but that would have been lame and disrespectful. I'm glad we got to see the scene where Luke kisses her on the forehead, because even though in the film that was meant as him saying goodbye, in real life it's really more of a send-off for her, and for all she's meant to this franchise. Also, since I brought up George Lucas, at one point in The Last Jedi, Yoda shows up as a spirit, or a manifestation of the Force, or however you want to define it. And in the movie, he resembles Puppet Yoda from the original trilogy, which was curious to me because the latest iteration of Yoda that we had seen prior to this film was in the last two prequels, where he was digitally rendered. And yet the people making The Last Jedi decided to bypass that version of him, even though Lucas has said that the reason he transferred Yoda to CGI is because that was his true intention for him. And it was startling to me, watching this movie, because these sequels are doing everything they can to pretend that the prequels never happened, and that anything that occurred in them doesn't count. There's even a moment when Rey does everything but ask Luke for a clinical definition of what the Force is, and Luke's answer is very spiritual and nuanced, even though in The Phantom Menace, it's stated that the Force is microscopic organisms, a revelation that the fans hated, and that it's pretty clear Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams hated too. The dynamic of this series is very unusual, and it never occurred to me until I watched this movie, but it's so bizarre that George Lucas, he's still active, he wrote the story for a movie called Strange Magic just 2 years ago, and yet he is an outcast from his own creation. And it's so extreme that the people making these new movies do not want to acknowledge the most recent entries in this saga that he made, and neither do the fans. Even the people most mad at The Last Jedi, the ones who think the negatives for it should be launched into the sun, even they will not go as far as to say that they want George Lucas back. It's very awkward, and it's kind of sad, honestly. There was something about seeing Puppet Yoda again that made me feel bad for George Lucas, right up until I remembered how much he sold Lucasfilm for. Because the day will come when he passes on, and when that happens, he will be universally celebrated all around the globe as a visionary and a genius and a brilliant filmmaker, and yet in the present time, no one wants anything to do with him, and the fans of his earlier work celebrated when Disney wrestled creative control of his properties away from him. That is all you need to know about how well the prequels were received. And while I'm going to bring this back to The Last Jedi to close up this video, I do think it's important to keep the prequels in mind if you're really of the impression that The Last Jedi is going to taint the franchise. Because let me tell you something. If Jar Jar Binks couldn't ruin Star Wars, if midichlorians couldn't ruin Star Wars, if that scene in Attack of the Clones where Anakin and Padme roll around in the grass couldn't ruin Star Wars, this movie is definitely not going to do it. The first 3 movies are safe. They will be an integral part of pop culture forever. And while it's ultimately up to you if you like or don't like The Last Jedi, you owe it to yourself to be objective about it, without worrying about what it means to the previous films or what it's going to do to Luke Skywalker's legacy or any of that noise. If fans just watch the film for what it is and not for what they want it to be or think it should be, I truly believe that the vast majority of them will grow to appreciate this movie. Or maybe they won't, and maybe 30 years from now, there will still be petitions going to delete all trace of it from existence. Either way, I don't really care, because all I know is how I feel about it, and I love this film. It is the most I've enjoyed anything Star Wars related since Knights of the Old Republic 1 for the old Xbox. But, did I enjoy it more than the next thing I'll discuss? Whatever the hell that is? There's only one way that I can think of to find out.